Hi, I'm Max Kaiser. Welcome to On the Edge. Time now to go to New York and talk with media activist, author, and filmmaker Danny Schlechter. Danny is out with a new book, Occupy, Dissecting Occupy Wall Street, a book that Greg Palast says offers an inside-the-tent point of view of the Occupy movement. Danny Schlechter, welcome back to On the Edge.
Hey, Happy New Year, Max. Great to be with you.
All right, Danny Schlechter, when and how did you first become involved in financial activism?
Well, I started writing about the debt crisis in 2005. I did the film In Debt We Trust, which warned of a coming meltdown. I was then called a doom and gloomer. I was called an alarmist. I didn't know what I was talking about. Bam, the markets melted down. Suddenly I went from being a zero to a hero, to a genius. Of course, I wasn't. Many people, yourself among them, were predicting this. But nevertheless, the people who were not predicting it were getting all the attention and all the ink. And then I went on to write a book called Plunder, which was really about the economic catastrophe that was emerging. That came out before Lehman Brothers collapsed. And then I began to rethink what I was doing. I began to realize that the financial crisis was not just a business story. It was a crime story. And so I did the movie Plunder, The Crime of Our Time, and the book, The Crime of Our Time. It's available at plunderthecrimeofourtime.com. So, I've been focusing on this, but all the while I was hoping that some resistance to Wall Street would emerge. Here were the situation which was getting worse by the day for ordinary Americans, unemployment, foreclosures, student debt crisis, on and on and on and on. And it seemed as if the whole population was, on drugs and was not really responding to this until Occupy Wall Street came along in September, and suddenly the whole climate changed. And finally, we had a movement, a global movement, fighting for economic equality and fighting against, in a sense, the 1%, really the 0.001% of the 1% who are dominating the economy and dominating decisions about financial matters. So that's what I've been working on. And in the course of it, I began reporting on the Occupy movement. First, before it even happened, I went to Spain, and I was in Madrid, the Plaza del Sol, where there was an occupation going on by the indignados, the people who rejected both political parties and were fighting for economic justice in Spain. So I saw that movement up close, and then it sort of came to New York in the Zuccotti Park, and I began covering it for Al Jazeera, for my own newsdissector.com blog and other blogs, and writing about it as much as I could. And I've now collected all of those articles into a book called Occupy, Dissecting Occupy Wall Street, which has come out from coldtype.net is doing the first version of it, and that's online now, coldtype.net. You can actually get a free download, but I'm hoping to get it out as a ebook and a regular book as well. Because it's very timely, needless to say, and it also offers an analysis that goes beyond the media coverage. The media was mostly interested in the confrontations between the police and the occupiers. If there, when it bleeds, it leads. When there's violence, media loves it. There's a confrontation. And by and large, the demands that powered this movement, the concerns that people had about our economy and our society were basically minimalized in the news coverage. It was mostly colorful stories, like the New York Times did one profiling one of the activists, But the media coverage changed because first the international media, like yourselves and others, began taking this a lot more seriously than the American press. So the American press had to play catch up. And the American press began, first they ignored it, then they ridiculed it, then they minimized it, and then they started covering it more seriously. And it got a tremendous amount of coverage. I mean, who's ever heard of a movement which after 6 weeks inspires protests in 1,000 cities? I mean, that's almost unheard of historically. And today they claim they're in 2,000 cities, of various forms of the Occupy movement. So this thing is not going away. In fact, the sign that I like and I feature in my book is a sign that says it's so not over. And that seems to be the case, although in winter and in the situation where the system is fighting back now by closing down the occupations, the movement is morphing into something new. Already just yesterday in Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan, the park was closed, barricaded by the police and by the realty company that owns the park. You couldn't get access. The public couldn't get into a public park, even though for months, they were saying the problem with this occupation is it doesn't let people enjoy the park. Well, now nobody gets into the park. It reminded me of that lieutenant during the Vietnam War who said, "We destroyed the village in order to save it."
All right, let me jump in here for a second. Now, you mentioned the Vietnam War. Danny Schlechter, back in the 1960s, you were part of the protest movement back then, the civil rights movement. How does the present-day Occupy movement differ from the 60s anti-war movement, Danny Schlechter?
Well, first of all, it's multi-issue as opposed to one issue. That's important difference. Secondly, it's mostly economic in its focus. It talks about the 99%. Versus the 1%. Its focus is on Wall Street, or it's been protesting Wall Street, although today there's a protest against the new defense bill that Obama signed. There's the big demonstration planned against unemployment. There's an Occupy the Congress protest being planned for the 17th of the month. So there have been more protests than ever, if you will, even though the park and the encampments are no longer there. But the movement is different in the sense that these are much more sophisticated young people. They have social media and technology to get the word out. They have their own media system. They're not just dependent on the mass media. They're actually, attempting to build a community as well as a protest movement. And that's really a kind of a politics of attraction, not just a protest. It's attracting people who feel comfortable to be part of it. It doesn't have leaders the way or personalities or big celebrities the way the anti-war movement did, Jane Fonda or some of the other activists. So it's different. It's really reflective of this generation, although it's multi-generational also, which makes it different.
All right, now let me follow up. Let me follow up on that. In the 60s, of course, the anti-war movement eventually succeeded in ending the Vietnam War. Do you think that the anti-financial war movement, the Occupy movement, can stop the banksters? Or do the banking criminals have weapons that are just far too powerful against the 99%, Danny Schlechter?
I think it's going to be a longer and a harder fight, believe it or not, because concentrated power doesn't really give up. But, the thing they have going for themselves, and this is something you point out too, Max, is that the system is falling apart. They've lost, the kind of credibility and support of the general public. The public is turning against the bankers. Yes, they're still in power, very wealthy, very important people in their own view, but they're really being delegitimized by so many people in the society. And, we're talking about a crisis that's getting worse in America, not better. Unemployment, foreclosure, and student loan crisis, just to cite three, are getting worse. 2012 promises to be much worse than 2011.
Let me cut in here for a second and ask you a question now. Back in the 60s, they had some very simple slogans that caught on: make love, not war, or stop the war. Slogans are a very big part of any movement. Now, in this movement, what stops this movement from adopting a simple slogan like stop the war? And the reason I ask this is because do the activists and protesters understand that it's not about reform, it's not about tax changes, it's not about a political tweaking, it's about ending the war, the war of financial weapons, a financial war against them. So why can't they pick up the banner of stop the war and just make it very simple? Because they're the victims of a war.
The problem is that the United States is fighting so many wars at the same time, with the danger of a new war against Iran basically being discussed. So it's maybe a little confusing if you say stop the war. People say which one.
All right. Well, let me follow up here. So the war that's going on is a war that's connected at the hip through Wall Street. So in other words, Wall Street derivatives and bankers, it's not really about greed so much as America has become addicted to war. They have become war junkies. And to finance these wars, they've got this Wall Street, Washington shadow banking system set up where they're trading on inside information back and forth to create the funds to finance the wars. So there is only one war. It's the war, it's a perpetual war perpetrated by America's war junkies. So I say, why not stop the war or go fight the war? I mean, those are the two options. Isn't that the case?
I'll pass on your suggestion. I mean, there is a war on the people that's going on here. I think people are beginning to see it. You know, they see the attacks by the police in city after city. They see the pepper spraying. They see the contempt that the people in power, show for the, people who are protesting. They see the fact that our rights and our liberties are disappearing. I mean, you're not even allowed to protest on Wall Street anymore. I protested there in 2007, 2008. You can't even get on Wall Street these days to protest. So, there is a definite cutback on our freedoms and our rights and a growing disenchantment with our political system. I mean, the whole Congress only enjoys a 7% public approval. I'm not even sure why it's that high. So you have a lot of people turning off conventional politics, turning off conventional media, who are sympathetic to this movement. Now, the movement has a lot of work to do to frame itself a little bit better, to organize itself, to clarify itself a little bit more. And there is a lot of, disagreements within the movement. Some people think, the goal is to create a park from which you can build a new society, kind of a bottom-up, back to the land kind of movement. Others, see the need to focus on issues, but sometimes there are so many issues that it lacks the coherency of the Occupy Wall Street theme. So these are some of the tensions within the movement, which is organized in a leaderless manner. It's decentralized. It has work groups that are operating on lots of different levels at the same time. And I have been advocating, we have to occupy the mainstream of America. We have to bring these issues to people who are in fact suffering from this economy, who are the victims of this war, working people, middle-class people, students, people who are minorities, people who are suffering because of what's happening here. 1 out of every 2 black men in New York is out of work. I mean, this is a depression for quite a few people here in this country, quite a few communities, although we're hearing it. There may be another recession. Of course, there is a recession. There is a depression already underway. So, as people recognize it, they want to fight back against it, and they are. And that's what's so incredible. Now, will the media continue to cover this? Most of the media covers politics in terms of conventional politics, primaries, the Republicans versus the Democrats, partisan divides. This movement transcends those partisan divides. It's saying the system is broken, the system isn't working, and they are fighting against increasingly the system. And of course, the media is part of the system. So, at points the media will cover it, and points they'll try to tear it down. But fortunately, because of social media, live stream technologies and the like, websites, this movement has a core and a constituency that I think is going to grow, particularly as the weather grows warmer. But, there was a protest at the Rose Parade in Pasadena, California. There are protests every day. And I think that it would be wrong to believe that this is somehow over because a park has been closed.
Right. Now, to follow up on this war theme, clearly America is losing a war against the bankers. If you look at a city like Detroit, or you look at municipalities throughout the nation, Montgomery, Alabama, that was recently destroyed by Goldman Sachs. America is losing the war against the bankers. The bankers say we're just competing, but they're not just competing. They're engaged in war crimes, and there are war criminals. And we know who they are. The leaders of these Wall Street banks are war criminals. So this movement needs to go to maybe to The Hague or someplace like this, a court of redress, where they can take these people up on war crimes because of their genocidal financial terrorism. Now, what stops that from happening? In other words, let's get serious, Danny, because all the demonstrations and all the protests aren't really amounting to anything because they're aiming too low. They want simple reform. They want tax reform. They want some kind of ecological reform. But they're missing the boat here. They're being shot at by terrorists who are war criminals. Now, are we going to get serious about this, or are we going to be back here next year talking about why Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein increased their bonus pool by another $50 trillion this year, and that they're going to go scot-free and not a single crime, not a single one goes to jail? When is the movement get serious, Danny? Because we're all quite bored with it at this point, because in America, they're just lying down and they're taking it. When does it get serious, Danny? Tell me.
Look, I think it is getting serious, and I think there's a process of how movements develop. They don't start fully formed. You know, four kids started the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. It took a while for the civil rights movement to get it velocity. Tahrir Square, it was 2 years in the making or more before the movement really developed. And, of course, they're in a new phase of that movement right now. So, I think we're seeing signs of a growing number of people committing themselves to this movement, believing in it. It takes time. In January, the ANC of South Africa is celebrating its 100th birthday. It took them 70 years to overthrow apartheid. Yes, we don't like it done overnight. We don't like a Alka-Seltzer. You put it in a glass of water, it bubbles over, and you feel better in 10 seconds. It's not going to be like that. And there's going to be backs and forths. There's going to be defeats as well as victories. But I think the movement in its analysis is becoming a lot closer to what you're saying. They're a lot clearer about who the enemy is. They're a lot clearer about the nature of the conflict that they're in. That's a good sign. And we need programs like yours, Max, frankly, to help educate this audience, to try to teach them more about financial matters. Not all are, at age 17 or 18 or 20, knowledgeable about it because our media doesn't cover it. You have a big following, among Occupy Wall Streeters. You have a big following in the United States, even though you're not on an American quote-unquote channel. Why? Because people are looking for information. They're looking to try to understand what's happening. That's why I wrote this new book, about Occupy Wall Street, to offer some analysis, to offer some discussion of it, and not just, a body count, how many arrests there were today. And the same thing is happening, I think, across the country. There's more debate, more discussion, more disgust with what Obama is doing. And I don't know where it's going exactly, but I think it's going. It's not standing still.
What are your thoughts on how the media in the U.S. covers Ron Paul? What are your thoughts on Ron Paul? He's clearly in the Republican camp, so many believe he espoused Republican values. However, what he's talking about seems much closer to a progressive agenda. So what are your thoughts on Ron Paul?
He's a libertarian, and there are many libertarians in the Occupy movement, which is interesting because this is not a movement of just one type of people. You have socialists, communists, activists, Democrats, left-wing people, and people who've never been political before. And there are many supporters of Ron Paul, particularly because of his stance towards the Federal Reserve Bank. And they're supportive of him. The media right now has been involved in tearing him down, along with the Republican Party itself, that's terrified that he could win, a primary and could become a very popular figure. He's the only one talking about foreign affairs. He's the only one opposing wars. So there are people on the left who are sympathetic to him and impressed by him, but they see a lot of contradictions in his stance in the past to the civil rights movement, racial justice, and the like. So it's more complicated. Personally, I'm very fascinated by him. You'll notice that the demand to open up the Federal Reserve books was led by Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders and some other Democrats. Even Barney Frank signed on to it. So, it's not clear that this is just a partisan issue. And to have somebody like Ron Paul talking about American intervention around the world in the Republican community and forcing them to hear it is important.
All right, we've got a couple of minutes left. I wanted to talk to you about the NDAA, this new bill that Obama signed, gives indefinite detention capabilities from the president, can detain anyone indefinitely. He concurrently had a signing order, which we know from the Bush years is nonsense. We effectively have martial law in America now. And this, of course, some would argue, would be on America's epitaph. This is the end of the America post-1776. The democratic institution and the country that we knew is now finished. Now, you're at risk, aren't you, Danny Schlechter? Because theoretically, if Obama administration doesn't like what you're saying, they can throw you in jail indefinitely with no trial, correct?
If they know that I'm on your program, that might not be so good for me. No, I'm kidding. Look, this is an abomination. And today there's going to be, or this week and weeks to come, there are going to be more protests against it. The Civil Liberties Union has finally issued a statement. Obama cleverly timed it during the New Year's period when people were into partying and celebrating and, not paying too much attention to what was going on in the news.
Isn't that kind of contemptuous of the American people? Isn't that kind of sick for the president to pass an infinite detention bill when he knows people are out drunk partying? I mean, isn't that the height of hubris?
I mean, clearly he is not what you would call a profile in courage. And he has been consistently, going back and forth. And many in the Occupy movement see him as a traitor straight out. Obama, is basically been cowed by the whole military-industrial complex from day one. His refusal to close Guantanamo was the sign that he was going to get along by going along. And this is, a disgrace. That's why people are furious about it. But he's already signed it. Whether or not they'll implement it or how they'll implement it remains to be seen. But it gives the state, outrageous power, and it forces us to lose our Bill of Rights, in essence. If some authority somewhere can determine that you are, an enemy agent and put you away with no trial, that's outrageous. And I think it's going to incite more resistance and more protest.
All right, Danny Schlechter, we're out of time. Thanks for being on The Edge.
Thanks again.
And if you want to send me an email, please do so on theedge@presstv.com. Until next time, Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.